Welcome to The One You Feed.
Simone Stolzoff was finishing a book on the value of uncertainty when he and his wife learned they were expecting. At a checkup around 3 months, the doctor couldn't find a heartbeat and asked them to come back a week later. So they waited. He'd just been writing about how the waiting is often the hardest part. Now he was living it. They ended up losing the baby. What stayed with him wasn't only the grief, it was how present that week made both of them. And that's what we get into, how to stay close to your life when you can't know how it turns out. His book is How to Not Know, The Value of Uncertainty in a World That Demands Answers. I'm Eric Zimmer, and this is The One You Feed. Hi, Simo. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you about your latest book, which is called How to Not Know, The Value of Uncertainty in a World That Demands Answers. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart in many ways. But we'll get into it after we start the way we always do, which is with the parable. And in the parable, there's a grandparent who's talking with her grandchild, and they say, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandchild stops, they think about it for a second, they look up at their grandparent and they say, well, which one wins? And the grandparent says, the one you feed. So I'd like to start off by asking you what that parable means to you in your life and in the work that you do.
First and foremost, I love this parable because I find it to be so true. As a naturally doubting and uncertain and ruminating person, I chose to dig into this topic of uncertainty precisely for the theme of the parable, which is we can choose to see uncertainty as a threat, as a source of fear, to catastrophize, to think of everything that will go wrong when we're in an uncertain situation, or we can feed that other wolf. We can choose to see uncertainty as the birthplace of possibility, as the precursor to learning and growth. And I often think about it in the context of this piece of advice that you sometimes give to people who are learning how to ski or snowboard, which is look where you want to go. And often if we spend too much time looking at uncertainty as a threat, as a source of fear or anxiety or worry, that's where we go. And yet if we're able to flip our frame, to change our mindset, and to see uncertainty as the place from which learning and growth and development and possibility and opportunity is all born, we can start to move in that direction as well.
Yeah, as a wannabe surfer, I'm learning, don't look at your board. You have to look where you want to go on the beach. I am told consistently. I only get to do it about twice a year, so I never actually get better, though. But the point is a good one. And what I like about your book is that it's part of a philosophy of why uncertainty is really valuable and all these things we talk about. And we'll get into that, but it does a really important thing also, which is it's lovely to know that uncertainty is good for us. It's a whole nother thing to learn to tolerate it long enough that it can do good for us, or to even tolerate it in general. And I think your book does a really nice job of doing all those things.
Thanks for saying so. Yeah, I think that idea of tolerating it for long enough is a really important learning that I had through the reporting and research for the book. There's this comedian, John Cleese, who you might be familiar with from the Monty Python, and he was asked to speak at a big company one day. And they asked him basically, how are you able to be so creative? How are you able to continue to produce such original work? And I loved his answer. He said, I'm willing to stick with a problem for long enough. And he has another friend, colleague in his office that is smart and has good intentions, but never seems to produce truly original work. And Cleese basically says, the difference, I think, between me and him is that he always goes with the first solution that comes to his mind, whereas I am more willing to stick with the problem. And I think that is exactly what you were saying about the value of building uncertainty tolerance, is that you can stick with the issue, stick with the problem, stick with your life for long enough to have that breakthrough, for the possibilities to emerge, as opposed to just going for the safe route or the quickest way away from uncertainty.
This feels particularly relevant in our current moment, where AI has the ability to shepherd us right past all the sticking with the problem long enough to come up with new ideas.
Yeah, very much so. In some ways, AI is a certainty machine. It gives you the probabilistic expectation of what you hope to receive based on the question that you ask. And especially speaking with young people, I see this all the time, where they think that because they can answer some of their questions with a chat query or the right prompt, that all of life's questions should be able to provide such immediate gratification or certainty. But I also see it in myself, whereas 10 years ago, I might have been okay not knowing the name of a given actor. Now I feel an almost involuntary need to reach into my phone. And so I think all of our tolerances for uncertainty, by nature of being in this hyper-connected digital age, are at risk of deteriorating. Right.
So uncertainty is naturally uncomfortable and is kind of built into us, and we're going to get into some of the biology neuro of all that. But I think you're making a point, which is that we've gotten worse at it because we don't have to endure it as much.
Yeah, well, there's two things going on. One is the world is getting more uncertain. So there's this economist from Stanford named Nicholas Bloom who's been tracking global uncertainty since the early 80s. And he's found that the 5 highest measurements since he began studying the phenomenon have all occurred in the last 5 years. So you think about the pandemic and shifting tariff policies, AI, and these wars overseas. So the world is more uncertain. The trend that is less often talked about is what we were just talking about, which is the decrease of our tolerance for uncertainty. And primarily this is correlated with the rise of the internet, and particularly the rise of mobile phones. I think phones do two things. One is they bring all of the world's uncertainties to our pockets. So now we can track the real-time updates of a war overseas or what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. And we can also track the real-time locations of our children and all of this information that hasn't necessarily made us any wiser and often just fuels our anxiety. The other thing that phones do is they rob us of the practice of sitting with what we don't know. And I know that you're a Zen practitioner. A lot of what I've gleaned from my meditation practice is the value of feeling that discomfort, feeling that pain, feeling that uncertainty, and not rushing to solve it right away. And so the world is more uncertain. Our tolerance for uncertainty is in decline. And that's why I argue so many people feel anxious and unmoored.
So when I read the title of your book, the first thing that popped into my mind is a Zen koan that talks about this, that I was like, I'll bring that Zen koan to the conversation. And then about 3 pages into the book, I was like, he's already got it. So why don't you share that with us?
Yeah, another sort of teacher and student moment. There's these 2 monks that meet in the forest. And the older monk, the more experienced monk, asks the student, what are you doing here? And the student says, oh, I'm on a pilgrimage. And the monk says, what are you on a pilgrimage for? And the student says, I'm not sure yet. And the monk says, not knowing is the most intimate. And I remember being in like a sangha in a meditation circle, and the teacher telling us this koan. And I was like, not knowing is the most intimate? What the heck does that mean? The thing that I feel most intimate when I don't know something is Google, But it's really changed my perception of uncertainty. And I think what intimacy, in my interpretation, what that means here is more proximate to reality as it actually is. When we are certain, when we think we know exactly when the market is going to crash, or when the relationship is going to end, or what the future of AI is going to bring, it has a sort of narrowing effect. It closes our mind. But if we're able to maintain that not knowing mind, maintain that uncertainty without rushing for easy answers, then we can see the world as it actually appears, as it emerges. And so by not knowing sort of the purpose of this pilgrimage, the student is more open to what the pilgrimage might teach him.
Yeah, and I think it's proximate to reality, and I think it's also an attention mechanism, right? When you think you know something, you stop paying attention to it. Whereas when you focus and give it more attention, and in that case, it actually becomes more intimate, because I think a lot of intimacy for me is about the things that I'm paying attention to, I am more intimate with.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think about this when I'm traveling all the time. I'll be in a foreign city that maybe I've never been to before. And I'll see an old man reading a newspaper outside of a cafe on the corner and say, oh my God, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And yet when I'm in San Francisco walking around, there's probably plenty of old men reading newspapers that I just don't notice because I have this assumption that I know where I am.
Yep. Okay, so let's start with talking about why is uncertainty so uncomfortable? We can talk about it being something that's ultimately good for us, and yet it is one of the hardest states to be in. Why is that?
It's biological. So you can think about it from an evolutionary standpoint. If one of your ancestors is in the jungle and there's a rustling in the bushes and they don't know the source of that noise, that uncertainty could be lethal. It could be a saber-toothed tiger. I feel like it's always a saber-toothed tiger in these sorts of examples.
I know. I'm wondering, like, what did the mastodon have a bad public relations person? I mean, it's always the saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly. But, I think the point stands, which is when we don't know, we can't plan. We can't necessarily guarantee our survival. And that is our primary function. It's our desire to stay safe and secure. And so from a feeling standpoint, when we are certain, it makes us feel like we can plan, and by extension that we are safe. It's why we like music that's based on repeating patterns, when you can anticipate what's to come. Uncertainty, on the other hand, makes us feel incredibly uncomfortable, because if you don't know the source of that noise, maybe it is the tiger. The problem is that our brains are also wired to see a lot of false positives. We often perceive uncertainty as a threat when it might just be a discomfort of being in a new place that we've never been, or the precursor to learning, or a feeling that is necessary to go through to discover the possibilities that might be sitting on the other side of our discomfort. So in order to build this uncertainty tolerance, we have to tell ourselves a different story, which is that uncertainty does not necessarily mean danger. Uncertainty can potentially be the cause of fear. It can be hard to deal with, but it can also be something that shows us something about ourselves or the world that we didn't previously know.
So you talk about 3 psychological or behavioral traps. I may be paraphrasing you there. Comfort, hubris, and control. And then you turn around and say, each of those has a sort of a corresponding virtue that would go with it. Openness, humility, acceptance. Talk to me first about the 3: comfort, hubris, and control, because that's really how you orient the book.
Yeah, so every nonfiction book needs its framework, and this is my framework. I originally wanted to call them the 3 horsemen of delusion, but my editor thought that was a little too highfalutin, and so we settled on the certainty traps.
I like it, but yeah, I get it.
In many ways, they're just these psychological tendencies that we have that keep us stuck without accepting uncertainty. So for comfort, for example, we all have a status quo bias. We probably all know a friend who's in a job or in a relationship that they know isn't quite working for them, but they'd rather the devil they know. They'd rather stay in a situation that is known and comfortable as opposed to exposing themselves to the uncertainty of what happens if they walk away. For hubris, this is our tendency to be excessively proud, our tendency to think that we know best. And I think this shows up all the time in the business world, where people claim to know exactly how many entry-level jobs will be wiped out by AI, or how the market is going to behave over the course of the next 12 months. The last is maybe the most pervasive, which is control, which is our desire to plan for all future outcomes, to need to know exactly how our career will progress, to need to know exactly what the future of the climate or our own death day will be. And although all of these psychological needs are born out of a place of wanting us to stay safe and secure and survive, they also come with costs. With comfort, if we are not willing to expose ourselves to uncertainty, we will never learn not just our own preferences, but what we are capable of. With hubris, it can be indicative of blind spots where you can't see ways in which you may be erring or not seeing an accurate picture of reality. And with control, our desire for control, particularly about things that we can't control, like macroeconomic conditions or climate change or these things in our life that are outside of our realm of influence, can suck so much of our energy and attention and take us away from the realm which we actually can control, which is our realm of influence. And so that's sort of the flip side of each of these traps. So on the other side of comfort is the growth and learning that comes from being outside of our comfort zone. On the other side of hubris is the humility that comes from admitting what we don't or can't know. And on the other side of control is the acceptance that comes from being able to separate what is in and outside of our power.
I think that's an important point to note, because I often think sometimes we think that we need to get to a place where we're not uncomfortable for things to be valuable. I mean, it's sort of the opposite of the comfort question. But there's a line you have from a researcher, and I love it. She says, uncertainty is annoying, difficult, and stressful for a reason, because if it wasn't, we wouldn't pay attention to it and take action.
Yeah, I love that too. Uncertainty is what incentivizes us to say, put on a seatbelt before we enter a car, because we're not sure whether the car is going to crash, or to maybe think twice before we reach for that berry that we're not sure is poisonous. And so in many ways, like many of the sort of emotions in the negative register, they can be great teachers. They can be instructive and tell us what we might need to pay attention to, even in the context of something personal like a relationship. If you're uncertain about something, maybe that is a flag that shows that you need to have a conversation with your partner about it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to abandon ship or leave right away, but uncertainty is that teacher. It is that sort of internal alarm system that's saying, pay attention to this. This might not be in your favor.
I want to talk about decisions, and you frame up this making decisions through three different people's perspectives: Ira Bedzo, Esther Perel, and Ruth Chang. Share about those.
So the broader context is that the book is narrative-based. So each chapter of the book is its own sort of mini case study. And in one of the chapters, I profile a couple. And they have been together for 17 years, married for 10, and they're out having a drink at a bar in New York City. And they decide to do something that other people thought was insane. They decide to go their separate ways for a year and then come back to the bar to decide whether they want to stay together 12 months later. They called it the Year of Living Dangerously. And I remember first hearing this story, and I was like, wow, I have to write about this. This is stranger than fiction. And I won't ruin the end. You'll have to read the book to find out what happens. But in the context of reporting this story, I reached out to all of these experts. So Esther Perel is this famed couples therapist. Ira Bedzo is this ethicist who was at Emory University. And then Ruth Chang is a philosopher. So it's sort of three different perspectives on this question of what do you do when you're uncertain about a relationship, but it can also be extrapolated to other facets of life. And they each have their own perspective. One of the lines from Esther Perel that I really loved was that trust is an active engagement with the unknown. So many people come to Esther and they say, how do I know whether I found the one? Or how do I know whether I am in the relationship or I should go on another date? And the truth is you can't know, especially not at the outset. You can't know whether this person is the right person or will be your one and only love or is worth exploring until you've actually transacted, until you've actually been able to take some of those leaps and find out whether they continue to show up. And so I love that idea of trust being an active engagement with the unknown. Bedzo is an ethicist, and so he works both at a hospital and with college students, helping them figure out their career. And whenever someone comes to him with an uncertain predicament, he always asks them the same three questions, and I love them all. The first is, what do you want? Pretty straightforward, but the idea here is to get out of your head and into a more embodied sense of desire. The second is, do you want to want that? Which is a little heady, but it's what ethicists talk about as your second order desires. So sort of your desires of your desires. So do I want to smoke a cigarette? Sure. Do I want to smoke a cigarette? Maybe not. Your sort of more reflective self. And the third question, which is the one that I like the most, is what does this choice say about who you are? And why I like it is because when we're making a decision, when you're at that crossroads and you can go left or go right, you can't necessarily know the outcome of your decision. And so that question, what does this choice say about who you are or who you want to be, taps into this aspirational version of ourselves. It helps align your choices with your values. And if you make a choice that's aligned, hopefully you can stand by your decision, even if you don't get the outcome that you desire. And the third is this woman, Ruth Chang, who's a philosopher. And she says that what makes a hard decision hard is not that one option is clearly better than another and you're just too stupid to work it out. What makes a hard decision hard is that one option is likely better for some reasons, another option is likely better for others, and neither is better overall. So rather than agonizing over trying to make the right decision or trying to find the perfect fit, she says, make a decision by whatever means you can, and then spend your energy telling yourself a story of why that decision is right, sort of retroactively weaving a narrative about all of the reasons why you made that choice. And I love that. The example that she gives is, imagine you're deciding what to eat for breakfast, and you're deciding between a bowl of fruit and a donut. The fruit is healthier. The donut is more delicious, but neither is better overall. And so you go back and forth, and you make pro-con lists, and you talk to your yoga teacher about it, and yada, yada. She says, make your choice, and then tell yourself the story. Today, I'm going for the donut because donuts are delicious, and I want to start my day with joy. And I think we can make lots of life's crossroad decisions from a similar vantage point.
Yeah, I think the danger there, of course, is the narratives that we can very easily tell ourselves about consistently making the donut choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're not careful. But I flip a coin for a lot of things. It drives my partner nuts. She's like, you can't just decide by flipping a coin. And I'm like, yes, I can, because I've spent 5 minutes and I can't tell the difference. And so it doesn't matter. I also love the Ruth Chang one because it also says something I think is really important, which is that we're too stupid to know which. Hard choices are hard not because of our ignorance. And I've been in situations where I've had to make very difficult decisions. The biggest, most wrenching one for me was my last marriage, right? And it just went on a long time, lots of many decisions. But one of the worst parts was that I just kept feeling like I should be able to figure this out. Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit of a relief to me, a little turning down of my psychological distress to go, you can't figure it out because this is a really difficult decision. And like you said, I've got two choices. Neither of these is particularly the one I want, or they're both good and bad in very different ways. And I think, so for me, for the trivial things, just making the decision is really valuable. And those more important things, I do think knowing that it's natural for this to be really difficult, it's helpful.
Yeah, there's a line from a psychologist that I quote in the book that I really like, this guy named Rollo May. And he says that commitment is healthiest not in the absence of doubt, but in spite of doubt. And what I love about that is it is not making an assumption that you should be able to rid or banish doubt or uncertainty from your mind. But it's by making choices in spite of not knowing exactly how they'll turn out that refines our character, that makes us into who we are. I remember in my own life this maybe lower stakes but equally as distressing decision between choosing to take a job as a journalist or to work at this design firm in San Francisco. The journalism job was on the East Coast. And, on one hand, it's like world's smallest violin, the agony of deciding between two attractive job offers. But on the other hand, it really sent me for an existential loop. And, maybe some of our listeners have been at a similar sort of crossroads where they can see two very distinct paths. There was sort of Simone, the designer, on one path, Simone, the journalist, on the other. And I was insufferable. I could not make up my mind for the life of me. And I talked about it with everyone I knew. And depending on the side of the bed I woke up in, I would change my mind. And what I realized in retrospect is exactly what you just said. What made the decision hard is not that there was a clear right path. It was one path was better for some reasons, another path was better for other reasons, and neither was better overall. And so what I had to do is be able to make a choice, to commit in spite of my doubt, in spite of my uncertainty. And in many ways, this book is just sort of a balm for the 28-year-old that was trying to make that choice in my life. You know, we write the books that we need to read.
Yeah. Well, that idea of the Harvard psychologist Ellen Langer talks about not making the right choice, making the choice right. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing that once you do, it's really very beneficial, as was suggested, to start the narrative about how this is the right choice and to live fully into that choice. You know, I remember the more recently, for me, my son trying to figure out college was a similar thing. I just was mm-hmm. like, there's no right answer here. Mm-hmm. There are variables we can't even begin to predict that we just can't know. Who's your roommate? Do you have a good roommate? Do you have a bad roommate? Who are your professors? I mean, there's so many factors that we just don't know. Like, let's make an informed choice, but then ultimately just realize, like, once the choice is made, now we go live it.
Yeah, as my Russian friend used to tell me, you make a choice and then you murder the alternatives, which I kind of like thinking about. Especially in the context of something like a college. You know, there's this decision strategist that I talked to for the book, this former professional poker player named Annie Duke. And she gave me this tool that I think is very helpful called the only option test, which is, imagine you're deciding between going on vacation to two equally as attractive places. Maybe one is Rome and the other is Paris. And, you know, it's a high stakes decision because it's expensive. You might not be able to take many trips like this in your lifetime. And so you agonize, you make pro-con list, you flip the coin again. What she says is, imagine someone had a gun to your head and said, your only option is to go to Rome. Would you be happy? And then imagine if that same person had a gun to your head and said, your only option is to go to Paris. Would you be happy? And if the answer is yes to both, maybe the decision matters less than you think. And so for your son, for example, maybe he's choosing between two schools. What makes the decision hard is the opportunity cost, is knowing that choosing one school means foreclosing on his options of choosing other schools. But if he only had one choice to make and he would be happy, maybe that's a decision that he can make relatively quickly.
Yeah. It's the other thing that the coin toss does for me is that I almost immediately discover that I had a preference after all when the coin comes up. Like, it's just, I can feel it. I'm like, no, or yet, right? And if I still can't discern, then I'm like, okay, truly, either one is a perfectly good choice. I want to move on to the next chapter, which has one of my favorite titles of any chapter in recent memory, which is The Prison of Our Preferences.
Yeah, so the story here is the story of a young fellow named Max, and he is a software engineer. In college, he actually studied software engineering and art, fine art, which I think is a little bit illustrative of the way that his career and his life developed. But he was a software engineer. He gets a job at Google, a sort of dream job. He moves out to the Bay Area. And after a few years of working, he has this uncanny feeling that his life is just sort of acting out this expected script, that each day just feels like rinse and repeat. And he goes to the coffee shop that's highly rated on Yelp, and he takes the optimal route to work on his bike, and he goes to the exact bar that you would think a 24-year-old living in San Francisco would go to. And so he decides to shake things up a little bit, and perhaps in an extreme way, which is he starts designing algorithms to make decisions on his behalf. In many ways, they're sort of like the souped up coin flips that Eric uses. And the first one he does is it taps into the Uber API and calls an Uber to his house and brings him to a location in the city known only to the driver. So it's sort of like a Uber roulette. And so he, gets to see all these different neighborhoods, these different places that he wouldn't have otherwise seen. Then he decides to dial it up a notch. And at the time, Facebook had this feature where you could see all of the public events in your area around you. And so he created his Facebook random event generator that would just tell him a random event to go to in the city, and then he would go. And at its most extreme, he quit his job and he created an algorithm to choose where he lives around the world. So each month he would roll the dice and it would say, Gortina, Slovenia. And he would pick up his bag and he would go to Slovenia and he'd live there for a year or a month. And then at the end of the month, he would roll the dice again and it says Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And he sort of lived his whole life this way for over 2 years. And what I like about it is, in the short term, you might think this man is like an uncertainty expert. This is like our sensei. We can learn so much about him from his tolerance of uncertainty, his willingness to expose himself into new situations. But I interviewed this psychologist named Michael Dugas, who really helped change my mind. And Dugas was one of the first people to link intolerance of uncertainty with a lot of anxiety disorders that he sees in his patients. And he says that when people are particularly intolerant of uncertainty, he tends to see one of two different behaviors. The first is people become obsessive information gatherers. You know, we probably all have a friend who needs to read like 300 reviews on Amazon before they buy a plastic water bottle. Or we become extremely impulsive. And he says neither is really an adaptive behavior. Like imagine you're trying to buy jeans. The information gatherer will have to try on every pair of jeans in the store. The impulsive person will have to buy the pair of jeans in the window. But both are sort of avoidant strategies to try to get away from the uncertainty that is inherent in making any choice in your life. And so on the surface, where you might see Max as someone who is really tolerant of uncertainty, by outsourcing the responsibility or the decision to the algorithm, he's in fact avoiding uncertainty. He's finding certainty and is not needing to choose himself. And so it was a fascinating chapter to report. And I think it taught me a lot about this balance between exploring and exploiting, this balance between wanting to learn about the world and novelty and new possibilities while also committing and having stuff that compounds that we can continue to return to and find meaning.
Yeah, there's a few different things. When I was reading that chapter, I was thinking about a story about the musician John Cage that I read recently. And as his career went on, he was a Zen practitioner to a certain degree. And so his idea was that the ideal music is the music in which the composer's ego is completely absent from. And so he would be doing things like just using the I Ching to pick chords. He was taking it like to such an extreme that when I first start reading about it, I'm like, wow, that is really cool. And then I listen to some of John Cage's music and I'm like, hold on a second. Like, you know, there is a role for the composer to be making choices. Again, I think he was proving points often with his music. But to me, it was that like, you know, how do we find the middle ground of I obsess over every last detail of everything I compose to the nth degree, or I absolutely, to your point, outsource all the decisions to some random generator. And I think the conclusion I came to after I read that and that you're sort of coming to right now is like, we got to find that middle place that works for us. And the other thing that I think's interesting about that exploit dilemma, right? The explore is you just keep doing different things. The exploit is maybe you try something that compounds, or you just keep, like, you know, you've got a good restaurant, you just keep going to the good restaurant. And what I found interesting about that dilemma is I think we can be on different parts of that spectrum for different parts of our lives. Like food-wise, I'm kind of an exploiter, like meaning that my uncertainty tolerance on food is less. You know, or my window of comfort is less. But other things, it's a lot more wide. Yeah. But I think the prison of our preferences is just I just love it because I see how more and more, particularly as I age, more of my choices get made by comfort. That's the one that is driving the engine. And it is not the one that I want driving the engine. I don't want to banish it to the outskirts. I think that prison of our preferences is a lot because, you know, if we look at Buddhism in general, there is a certain degree of, hey, you are suffering because you are very attached to this going one way or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, at the very least, if you're too attached to one way of life or one dish from a restaurant or one job title, you become fragile because that thing might get taken away from you, or you might not be able to go to that restaurant, or you might get laid off or furloughed. And so that's one case for diversifying your preferences or diversifying.
North Star. Don't even say that North Star could go away.
Hope not.
Don't even suggest it.
But I think there's trade-offs on both ends of the spectrum. So if you do too much exploration, too much novelty seeking, your life doesn't necessarily move in a particular direction. And this is what Max ultimately found. He spent all this time traveling and seeing the world, but it had diminishing returns. Whereas if you do too much exploitation, too much leaning into what you already know and you like, that has a few costs as well. One is you might miss out on a preference that you didn't know you had. The restaurant around the corner that you might like a little bit better, or like better certain days of the week, or the dish on the menu that you didn't know that you wanted to order. And so in addition to it being person dependent and dependent on maybe different facets of your life, I also think it changes a lot as we age, and people who are older might need a little bit less exploration as they become a little bit more calcified in their ways. Whereas if you're younger, you might need a little bit more exploration as you're trying to determine your tastes and figure out who you are. But the most important takeaway in my mind is that we all need both. Yeah. We need to have some certainty and some uncertainty to live a fulfilling life.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to that aging piece, you raise a point that I think about a lot, is that I notice tendencies of aging in myself that I don't generally like, and resisting the things that come with aging is not exactly a graceful way to go about it, but nor is giving in to the tendencies that come with it. So, figuring that out is always sort of a nuanced path.
Yeah, very much so.
All right, let's move on from here. And I want to talk about doubt. Talk to me about the role of doubt as a positive force in our lives, or the cost of not doubting, whichever way you'd like to go.
Yeah, I mean, they go hand in hand, right? If you're too overly confident, if you don't introduce any sort of doubt or uncertainty into your thought process, you're prone to have large blind spots. And we see this all the time. There is a benefit to having expertise and experience, but the cost is that we are these pattern matching brains. And if you always expect something to go a certain way, you might miss out on something that's outside of your purview. The classic image, which I really like a lot, is you can become a drunk man looking for his keys under the streetlight because that's the only place that's illuminated. And so one of the things that introducing doubt, or maybe in an organizational context, dissent, or in your personal life, some uncertainty, is it makes you think twice. It makes you pay attention to what you might be missing. It makes you find evidence to support your claims, as opposed to making assumptions that you know are right. The problem is that introducing too much doubt or too much uncertainty can be paralyzing. It can keep you from making a choice at all. There's this one study that I talk about in this middle section about hubris that I really like a lot. And it was conducted at a university, and they broke students up into small groups to solve a murder mystery. And a majority of these students were in Greek life, so fraternities or sororities. And in certain groups, they were homogenous, so they were all people from the same frat or sorority house. And in other groups, they were more heterogeneous. They had people from different houses. And then they worked on the murder mystery and then came up with their results and then rated how effective they thought their group was. And the findings were fascinating. Groups that had diversity in them, of people from different houses, were correct at a much higher rate. They were better decision makers. And yet the process of coming to a decision, they rated as less effective. Whereas people that were part of an in-group, this homogenous group of people that were all in the same sorority, for example, had an easier time coming to consensus. They thought that they worked better together, but they were less effective. And I think you can take this finding and think about so many aspects of your life or your organization that probably falls in line, which is to say that when we are surrounded by people who always think like us, it feels good. There's less tension, there's less friction, but often you're prone to blind spots or mistakes in your thinking. Whereas when there is a diversity of perspectives or of ages or people of different teams or people of different life circumstances, there is friction. And maybe that's by design. That friction is what leads to more comprehensive decision making. And even though it doesn't feel as good, often the ultimate outcome is more accurate. And so that's sort of a tension that we're all having to navigate in the context of our businesses or our lives, our families, our relationships. Maybe there's no better source of a frictionless decision than one that you only have to make with yourself. And yet when we surround ourselves with other people, there is always going to be a little bit of a rub, which is maybe by design.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite studies in the book, too. I found it absolutely fascinating that you would objectively be worse at solving the problem, but think you were better at it because it made you comfortable. It made me think of a couple things. My career before I did this was in software. And so a lot of times, we would get brought a problem as a leader, and there's like one person that knows the answer.
Yeah.
And intuitively, it makes sense to me. I'm like, yeah, of course, that's probably exactly what's happening. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that was the case, and rushing down that path would get us to an answer far faster. Mm-hmm. But there were plenty of times that I rushed us to decision because the people that I most liked agreed with me. Mm-hmm. Now I couldn't see that at the time.
Yeah.
The other story that it made me think of is I did this like outward bound expedition several years ago. Mm-hmm. And it's an organization that takes people out into the wilderness and trains them to do well out there. And so we were out on a 9-day thing. And in the beginning, our guides sort of told us where to go. But as the week went on, we had to make more and more of the decisions with a map and a compass. Mm. The whole process was always uncomfortable because you broke into 4 groups. And in each group, you're debating what's the right answer. Then you have to all come together and all agree on the right answer and collectively. So the whole process was fraught with that uncomfortableness. But I remember one time, all of us except one woman thought we knew the right way to go. Mm-hmm. And this woman was by nature a very retiring, shy, not comfortable confronting people, but she just sort of stuck to her guns. And you can see where this is going. She was the right one.
Yeah.
And I just loved that story as another example of sometimes that dissenting opinion, as annoying as it is, right? Because I'm just like, can we just wrap this up? I've got like a 40-pound pack on my back. Here we go, but she saved us hours. She saved us hours by being willing to be the one that disagreed. And I think in a beautiful personal empowerment way, I think it was a huge lesson to her that I can have an opinion. It's valuable and it's right. It was kind of a beautiful thing.
It is beautiful. And I think the fact that she is by nature shy gives her more credibility, because often, especially in a business team context, you're often listening to the loudest voice in the room, or the person that gets paid the most's opinion. And it shows, this is classic groupthink, right? If everyone starts thinking one way, you just want to get on the bandwagon. But if you're willing to stick to your guns and back it up with evidence and share your thinking, that actually will ultimately lead to better group decision making.
Yeah, the thing that I found difficult in that work context also is that sometimes there's just the person that disagrees because that's what they do, right? And you're like, I don't really want to pay that guy a ton of attention, but sometimes he actually is right, and so there's a tendency to be like, all right, you're just slowing this whole process down, Anyway, no short answers to any of that, but it certainly made me think about that as we looked at that chapter.
There's a framework that I like when it comes to making these types of decisions in a business context, which is rather than thinking just about consensus as what we're looking for, like everyone saying yes or everyone saying no, there's a middle ground, which is safe enough to try. And so rather than it just being we need 100% in or 100% out, being willing to run the experiment, being willing to try something. Let's say, let's go for this direction in 5 minutes and then reassess is often a better way of trying to balance that tension between wanting to, disagree and commit versus wanting to talk it over one more time.
And that's beautiful, going back to the prison of your preferences also. Like, is this safe enough to try is a great question. Like, I'm really not losing that much by, moving outside of what I would normally do here. I love the Voltaire quote, doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is an absurd one.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I notice in the world, and I'm not alone in noticing this, is that certainty is very rewarded in a lot of places. Even if I look at the world that you and I are sort of in, which is, I don't know, I want to call it personal development, business advice, self-help, whatever you want to call it, right? The people who are really certain that they have the answers tend to do well in a lot of ways. Is this just back to the uncomfortability of what uncertainty is, and just as a people we'll just be like, I'd rather not wrestle with that question. I'd rather not have all the nuance.
Yeah, we all want to hitch our wagon to the leader that has a very clear idea of exactly what the future will look like, or, in the most extreme, maybe a cult leader who tells you exactly what the world is going to do or exactly the steps you need to take to get to heaven. The problem is these hubristic leaders are attractive and not always correct. And so it's easy to sort of outsource your worldview, or to say, okay, I'm just going to follow this politician or this CEO or this, self-help guru into the dark. And yet, especially with anything that hasn't happened yet, the idea that we can be certain is a fallacy. Yeah. And particularly in these moments like the one that we're living through right now, where there is so much precarity and uncertainty, the peddling of certainty just increases. You turn on the TV and there's someone that's going to tell you exactly who's going to win the election. You open your app on your phone and someone tells you the food that you need to eat if you want to live to 100. And it's attractive. You get it. It sort of taps into this, person in the jungle that's like, oh, when I'm certain, then I feel safe, then I can plan, then I feel secure. Yep. The problem is it's often wrong, or at least not the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah, I notice it in myself, and I think like my entire worldview is sort of nuance and questioning, and yet I feel the same pull. I'm like, maybe they really have figured out how to do 200 hours of therapy in 20 minutes. Right? Maybe this person really has cracked the code.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we all have that tendency in ourselves to look for the path of least resistance, or the easier answer. And to say that it's nuanced, or it's not black and white, or maybe you're wrong, is not as attractive. And I think it's true. For example, thinking about a CEO, no one wants a leader that just says, I don't know what's going to happen. And yet the leaders that say, this is exactly what's going to happen, they are often wrong. And so I think we need a little bit of both. We need the types of leaders who are confident about what they know, are humble enough to admit what they don't know, and who are willing to design a plan for learning and figuring things out.
Yeah, I faced this when I was writing my book, because I'm a big believer there's not like one size fits all solutions, right? Everybody's life is different. There's so many varying circumstances. So my natural tendency, if I'm not careful, is to hedge everything and caveat everything and create 8,000 pages worth of endnotes. But at a certain point, then I'm just not saying anything, right? To write "it's complicated" and hand it back to my editor is not exactly a good book.
Yeah, I love that quote. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think it's true. You can't take a picture of the whole world. You need to put up a frame. You need to have constraints. And of course, lots of pieces of advice are one size fits all or overly prescriptive, but sometimes they sort of function like the coin flip, where they give you something to react to, and you don't have to necessarily accept it whole hog, but it's nice to have people who are willing to put a stake in the ground.
So one of the things that I really liked in the book was sort of a 2x2 decision matrix. Can you share that with me?
Yeah. Basically, the two axes are Is this a decision that is of high consequence? Or are the stakes high? Or is it a decision of low consequence with lower stakes? And is it a decision that is in my realm of influence? Or is it a decision that's outside of my realm of influence? And we spend a lot of time focused on decisions that we have no control over, or decisions that are of low consequence. And what we should actually be spending our time is only that one quadrant of high stakes decisions that we have control over. And another way to think about this is through what you might know as the serenity prayer, which is very popular in any sort of addiction or 12-step program. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't control, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I think the majority of the decisions in our day-to-day lives are in that low consequence quadrant. They are about what to eat or what to wear or what to watch on the TV. And not to say that those decisions don't matter at all, but you can often make those decisions quickly because the cost of making a wrong decision is relatively low. They're what are sometimes referred to as two-way door decisions, where if you make the decision, you walk through the door, you realize you made the wrong decision, you can walk back through that door.
My friend Chris gets hung up, though, because he can't decide what clothes to wear. He often ends up just going out in public with nothing on.
Poor Chris, or maybe a blessing to everyone around him for the positive externality.
I'm not going to comment on that second part. All right.
The other types of decisions that are in our control are obviously, the decisions that are more like one-way door decisions. Questions like, should I marry this person? Should I buy this house? And those are decisions that warrant a more analytical decision-making process. The problem is when we take our frameworks from one-way door decisions and apply them to two-way door decisions. And I'm sure we all have a friend that will go back and forth on whether they want to get the pizza or the pasta, and then they put in their order, and then they change their order. We could afford to be making some of those two-way door decisions a lot quicker.
Yeah, I love that idea of there's one quadrant that's worth paying attention to. I think the tricky part, because I've thought a lot about this, I've lived with a serenity prayer for 30 years now since I came into recovery the first time, is that so many things don't fit cleanly into either column. And I think that makes things trickier. I was talking with somebody who'd had a chronic disease for a long time, right? And we were talking about how, there's part of that process which is learning to accept that your life is kind of the way it is, but also recognizing there's things you can change. Or I think about we could say well, you're not in control of your, what happens with your finances, which ultimately is true. The stock market could implode tomorrow. There's nothing there. But there's a lot that I can influence in that. And that's why I love you using the word influence more than the word control, because I do think a lot of these things are matters of influence. Even I may not be able to control when I die, but I certainly can influence how likely that is to happen in, next week.
Yeah, I really like that distinction a lot. And it makes me think that we can make decisions that plan for that uncertainty, in the same way that an investor benefits from diversifying the stocks in their portfolio as a tactic that helps them hedge against a future market that they don't know. We can do that in our personal life too. My first book was called The Good Enough Job, and it was about the value of diversifying our identities beyond just what we do for work. And one of the main arguments is that when you're able to see yourself as more than just a software engineer or an accountant or a lawyer, it allows you to have a more broad foundation so that even if you were to lose one pillar of your identity, the house can remain standing. And I think that's a lot of our work in this current moment where we don't know what the future holds. We don't know whether AI is going to undermine these industries or whether the president is going to lead us to a world war or what have you. But you can do things in your life that are both commitments in spite of that uncertainty and things that plan for an uncertain future, like hedging.
I was thinking of going to the story of you and your wife, the pregnancy. And part of what I really like about that is that even as someone who knows all this about uncertainty, how living in it is actually still challenging.
Yeah. So while I was reporting the book, my wife and I were trying to get pregnant for the first time. And we did, and we were so excited. We started planning this future. We got the app that says, how big is your baby based on what week you're at. And we started calling this unborn kid Poppy. And about 3 months in, we were at the doctor's office, and she said, at this stage in the pregnancy, we'd expect to see a heartbeat, and I'm not picking one up on the ultrasound right now. And, of course, our minds go, oh shit, what's happening? And she said, why don't you come back in a week, and then we can do some more tests and see where we're at. So not only did we have to deal with the prospect of miscarriage, but we also had to deal with the waiting. And I'd just been writing about these studies about how, a study at the University of College London where participants were given either a 50% chance of receiving a painful electric shock or an 100% chance of receiving a painful electric shock. And those with the 50% chance were far more stressed and anxious than those with the 100% chance. Or a study of breast cancer patients where they found that the period between getting a biopsy and getting a diagnosis is often the hardest part of the entire breast cancer journey. It's the waiting, it's the uncertainty. And here I am writing about this stuff, and then I have to deal with it in my own life. And I remember that week very clearly. It was tough. There was no two ways around that. But there were also some beautiful moments. My wife and I would maybe make eye contact in a crowded room or hug for a little bit longer. It sort of had a slowing down of time. We were very present in our experience. And sure enough, we come back to the doctor a week later, and it was what was called a pregnancy demise. We lost the baby. And what that story taught me is that uncertainty is tricky by design. In the last chapter of the book, I talk about grief and death. And there's this one line that I keep coming back to, which is the fact that we live in a death-denying culture robs us of the ability to appreciate how we want to live. And the loss was really hard. And now, this is a few years later, we were able to conceive again. And I think we appreciate that baby just a little bit more because we went through that negative experience. But all of the wisdom of the book, this idea of finding your anchors, of finding the things in your life that you are certain about, this idea of trusting in your future self, this idea of being willing to transact in spite of not knowing, I got to live it in my own life. And every time I look at my son now, I think a little bit about that loss and how it helped me become more appreciative of the life that I do have.
Well, that is a great place for us to end. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. You and I are going to continue in the post-show conversation where I'd actually like to take those 4 lessons of living with uncertainty that you gave us in 15 seconds and explore them a little bit more, some, even more practical tools for living with uncertainty. So listeners, if you would like access to that and not have to live with the gnawing uncertainty of what brilliant thing did Simo say, as well as ad-free episodes, and really importantly, supporting something that with no uncertainty you love, go to oneyoufeed.net/join. Thank you so much, Simo.
Thanks for having me on the show.
All right, into the post-show conversation. Do you need a moment or are you good?
No, I'm good. Let's keep rolling.
All right. Hi, Simo. Welcome to the post-show conversation.
Thanks. I'm still here.
You're still here. But listener, if you're hearing this, it is because you have taken the time to support the One You Feed, and I want to say thank you. All right. So you kind of at the end there went through, you call them invitations for living better with uncertainty. And I'd like to spend a couple more minutes on each of them. First one's find your anchors.
So the idea here is that when we are certain about some aspects of our life, it makes it easier to hold uncertainty in others. I think this is particularly useful in this current moment in time where it feels like so much is up in the air. But maybe in your personal life, an anchor is something like your commitment to live in a particular place, or your commitment to a partner or a spouse. In a business context, maybe it's a commitment to a set of values or a mission or a commitment to serve a particular customer. But when we become clear on those anchors, those anchors are like the steady boulders that will remain amidst all of the changing winds around us. And I love this idea that we can choose some of these anchors in our life. Maybe it's a ritual or a routine, but a life that is fulfilling and meaningful is not free from certainty. Having those certainties is what makes it easier to hold the uncertainty in other facets of our lives.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve an equation that's all variables. You can't do it,
Yeah.
but you get a couple anchors, you fill in a few variables, the equation becomes solvable.
Particularly in this age of abundance, where often we suffer from having too much optionality or too much choice or too much possibility. We need to be able to erect some of those constraints, and it actually leads to better and more creative thinking.
Okay, number 2 is to choose curiosity over comfort.
Yeah, the idea here is something that we alluded to earlier, which is comfort by design is comfortable. It keeps us in our status quo, in our filter bubbles, in our little bubbles of communities of people that we know. But if we want to grow and learn, we have to be willing to step outside of that comfort zone. We have to be willing to strike up a conversation with a stranger, to not assume that we know everything about someone based on who they voted for or what bumper stickers they have on their car. We have to be willing to step outside of our own sense of what it is that we know and we like in order to discover those other possibilities. I'll tell a quick story from the business world, which is in the early 2000s, there was this gaming startup called Tiny Speck, and they had built this massive online multiplayer game called Glitch that was sort of the belle of the ball. They raised $17 million before they launched. Their launch was covered in the New York Times. They had tens of thousands of active players right away. And yet the founder had the sneaking suspicion that the company was not on a sustainable path. So he decided to do something that others thought was crazy. He shut the game down, sort of at the peak of its success. And if you ask him at the time, he said, I didn't necessarily know what the opportunity was or what we were going to pursue, but we discovered it. And what he decided to do is, while they were building the game, they built this internal communications tool to help them collaborate across different offices. And he shut down the game, offered to make his investors whole, offered his employees that wanted to leave the chance to walk away. And then with everyone that was left, they pivoted around this internal communications tool. And that tool is what you and I both know today as Slack. And it's become one of the most successful enterprise businesses of all time. And what I love about that story is that in the moment, Stuart Butterfield, the founder, didn't necessarily know what he was working towards, but by his willingness to follow his curiosity, to step outside of his comfort zone, he discovered something that was greater than anything he could have imagined before.
That's an extraordinary story. I don't think I knew that one. And, we hear about entrepreneurs pivoting all the time, but you usually pivot because things aren't going well. You find like, I pivot and, it's because the game's going poorly, but you know what? I've got this other piece of software. Maybe that's the one. But this guy, chose intentionally. That's really amazing.
Yeah. And sometimes they call it in statistics transcending a local maxima. So you imagine you're standing on a mountain, you think you're on top of the world. Maybe there's a taller peak around the corner, but you have to be willing to descend the first mountain in order to find the second.
That's a really interesting idea. Okay, number 3, trust your future self to handle future problems.
So this idea comes from a friend of mine named Emily, who's a psychologist, but before she became a mental health professional in her early 20s, her mom was given a potentially terminal diagnosis. And so for weeks, Emily was sort of by her side in the hospital, and she was really struggling to cope. She was riding this roller coaster of fear and anticipatory grief. And maybe some of you who have cared for a loved one know this precarious place. And one day, a family friend of hers named Bill, who's an oncology doctor who has a lot of experience dealing with people at the end of their life, came to visit and said, Emily, how are you doing? And she said, honestly, I'm not doing very well. I'm terrified, and I'm not sure what I'll do if my mom passes away. And Bill said something very wise. He said, Emily, the version of you that will be born into existence if or when that awful event takes place will be born into existence in that moment, and she will have more context, more information, and be better equipped to deal with it than you are today. You have to trust in your future self's ability to handle your future problems. I love this little piece of wisdom, trust in your future self, because so often we rush out to meet our suffering. We think about all of the worst case scenarios or everything that could go wrong. And in Emily's case, she is grateful that she heeded Bill's advice because her mom ended up recovering and making it out of the hospital, and she didn't needlessly have to suffer about something that never came to pass. And so I think about this all the time in this moment we're in where so much feels uncertain. How can I cultivate self-trust? How can I trust in my future self to be able to handle those future problems?
What I really love about that is one of the ways that I work with uncertainty or fear is that I remind myself that I have solved so many problems before. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of looking to my current and past self's ability, which is good. But I also love that idea of, you know what, the future me will be even better equipped than the me today. You know, that person will be, as you say, born into existence. So I love the idea of, in addition to looking back at my past ability to solve problems, to also trust in my future ability to. Mm-hmm. I like that.
Thank you.
All right, let go of the ghost ships that did not carry you.
Yeah, so this is, how I end the book. And it's this idea that comes from the writer Cheryl Strayed. And she wrote this advice column for a number of years. And in one of her advice columns, someone asks about the decision whether or not to have a kid. And she says that, basically I can't make that decision for you. But wherever we're making these big life decisions, it's as if we're standing on a pier. And making a choice is like jumping onto one ship. But at that same moment that you make that choice, a fleet of other ships also embark. And they're sort of the lives that you could have led. Maybe there's the version of you without a kid, or the version where you married this person, or where you moved to this city instead of that city. And part of what it means to be human is being able to wave at those ships as they fade into the distance, to be okay with the lives that you didn't choose in order to live the life that you did. And I just love this image insofar as it relates to uncertainty, just thinking about this vast sea with all of these different ghost ships. And the only one that you actually get to ride on is the one that you've chosen. But the important part is that you actually choose, that you step onto the ship as opposed to letting them all depart without you.
It's slightly more poetic than, I can't remember what your friend said, but basically murder all the other possibilities. What was it?
Murder the alternatives, exactly.
Okay. Cheryl's is a little more poetic, but they both are pointing at a similar thing. Yeah,
we'll give her that.
All right. Well, Simo, thanks so much for the post-show conversation.
Yeah, it was great to be in conversation with you. I couldn't have thought of a better interlocutor for this chat.
Oh, what a beautiful word, interlocker. Thank you.
If what you just heard was helpful to you, please consider making a monthly donation to support the One You Feed podcast. When you join our membership community with this monthly pledge, you get lots of exclusive members-only benefits. It's our way of saying thank you for your support. Now, we are so grateful for the members of our community. We wouldn't be able to do what we do without their support, and we don't take a single dollar for granted. To learn more, make a donation at any level, and become a member of the One You Feed community, go to oneyoufeed.net/join. The One You Feed podcast would like to sincerely thank our sponsors for supporting the show.